because we're very lucky to have Claire Wardle here with the First Draft Coalition and doing a lot of work over at Shorenstein, thinking about the phrase that shall not be named, that starts with the letters F and N, and we will say nothing more about it because it is not a useful term, and she will tell us why, I'm sure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So welcome back, everybody. I'm pretty excited about this next set of speakers because we're all women. That doesn't happen all the time. If we were up here at the same time, so we could take a picture and add it to the other Tumblr of amazing panels that are all women. So I was asked to talk a little bit about this space, and many of you have heard me in the past talk about the thing that I didn't realize people had got to know me about, which is the refusal to use the phrase, which this time last year, I just was frustrated because I felt like it didn't encompass the whole ecosystem. But just talking to Jennifer Preston, I think actually there is now a recognition that this time last year we were focused on Macedonian teenagers, and that actually did make sense to use that phrase. It doesn't make sense when we're talking about dark posts on Facebook. It doesn't make sense when we're thinking properly about memes and visuals, and Arne is here who knows so much about it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the field and kind of tee us up a little bit for tomorrow, because for me, how can we actually create a research roadmap that will be helpful? So last year, I spoke at 32 conferences on this subject. And if I was organized, that would be excellent for my airline points. I'm disorganized, so unfortunately, I'm not sitting on an amazing future life full of free trips to Thailand. But great, we all got together many times last year, and we had chats like we're having now. The great thing about this conference is I think tomorrow we're going to start trying to move some of this stuff on, which is what we really need to do. The one that I didn't actually speak at was at the Shorenstein Center, which is what led to us moving First Draft to the Shorenstein Center. And a big part of us taking First Draft there is to try to say, how can we actually do research in the field, but do it within a framework where we can research effectively what's working and what doesn't? We know from the talks this morning, we know so little concretely about this space. We've got a lot of things we can say. We hear a lot of anecdotes about, yeah, my son, the way he uses Snapchat. It's not really a way that we should be building regulation, which is, to my point now, the reason that I'm kind of frustrated that we had 32 conferences last year is that the problem is now people are starting to move in this space. They are about to pass regulation in this space. And my frustration is that we still actually haven't come up with shared definitions about what we mean about this issue. So it's fine to have conferences about it, and as an academic by training, I love to talk and to say that it's complicated and to really struggle with definitions and with meaning and theory. But what does it mean when Damien Collins next month is about to put out a report after a year of the Select Committee in the UK looking into this topic of, surprise, surprise, it's called fake news? What does it mean when in Italy, the police are actually starting to get involved on the run-up to the election? What does it mean in France when the beautiful Emmanuel Macron is foolishly thinking that he's about to pass a law that's completely obsessed with electoral integrity? What does it mean when this conversation is framed entirely around political disinformation? Because we only started caring about this when Trump got elected. And as a result of that, it's framed the question in a US context and a political disinformation context and a Facebook context. When actually this problem is global, it's about closed messaging apps, and it's actually about science and health disinformation. What does it mean when in whatever happens in Europe, this is going to become a blueprint for places like Singapore, which is now about to start its own inquiry, as is Indonesia, and Brazil is going to punish creators of fake news ahead of their election in October. So I know that we're here, we're in the US. I love Americans, but sometimes America can be a little bit obsessed with itself, and the conversation can be focused very much on the US. This is a global problem, and whatever the conversations we have here, they are being watched globally by good actors and bad actors, by people who just want to feel like they're doing something. So we have a real responsibility to do the research that's needed that will make an impact with regulators who absolutely don't know. There's no evidentiary base for them to make these decisions, and they're saying that. I'm currently, unfortunately, I won't be here tomorrow because I'm part of a nonsense titled high-level expert group on fake news, and we're meeting for the 4th time on Wednesday, and there will be movement. There will be a report out from our group at the end of March. And I'm terrified that whatever we put out is going to become that blueprint. And in those conversations, there's no blueprint even for this space because it's not illegal speech. The EU has done great work around illegal speech, code of conduct on hate speech. What we're talking about here is not illegal. So how do you start regulating around something that's not illegal? It's really dangerous, but people desperately want to do something. And there's no time for us to have a really useful conversation about what does freedom of expression look like now. You know, there was a great, I did a talk on Wednesday at Data and Society, and Nabir Saeed was there from BuzzFeed saying, you know, everybody talks about the First Amendment here, of course, but what does the First Amendment really look like in a context where there isn't a free marketplace of ideas, because I can't actually access all the information in this huge information ecosystem, because it's not possible. It's information overload. So how does the First Amendment work in that context? So at First Draft, we have a partner network, and something that I'm really passionate about is we're not going to solve this if we keep sitting in our silos. So I go to wonderful conferences with researchers. I go to wonderful conferences with fact checkers. I go to wonderful conferences with verification specialists. Actually, we need to be in these rooms together more often because there's real expertise in all of those different groups. And how do we build a research framework that acknowledges that the knowledge that we have as academics and researchers can really help practitioners who say, I don't actually know how I should be wording a fact check headline. Am I doing more harm than good when I word it in this way? I don't know. There's some stuff in the social psychology literature, but I can't really read it or understand it. It's 8,000 words. You know, how do we start talking in a way that's helping those people who are trying to do work every day? So I wrote a report with Hossein Darakhshan that was published last October for the Council of Europe, and it was trying to think about information disorder. It was an attempt to, as you can imagine, stop using that phrase. And we tried to break it down, and this comes from my background as an academic, which is how can we start thinking about definitions in a more careful way? So we were talking about misinformation versus disinformation versus malinformation. We tried to break it down to say, you know, what are the research questions specifically about the agents? What are the research questions specifically about types of messages? And what are the research questions in terms of how people interpret these messages? Because those of you in this room who potentially come from a communication background, I have a PhD in communication, we debunked the hypodermic needle model in the 1940s. The way that people talk about the impact of the Russian ads on the election here, it's a little bit hypodermic-y, which is this fear that somebody vaguely touched an ad and it affected their voting behavior. Like, how do we effectively think about and measure how people share content? So we did a project in France last year around the French election called Crosscheck, and we worked with over 30 different French newsrooms to collaboratively monitor and verify this kind of information. We then went through the data to try to analyze it. We, for example, would have a debunk as a video on Facebook, and it would get 1 million shares. Half of those shares would be a thumbs up emoji. Half of those shares would be a poop emoji. How do you start measuring that? What does that mean? Like, how do we think about agency when, you know, we know, as you know, Ethan started with, people don't passively consume this, but we're really struggling to have methods for understanding how the impact of this. So we did a conference at Annenberg in December, and it was trying to address some of these things. And we actually asked 15 different people, 10 researchers, 5 practitioners, to write very short chapters. And this is going to be published later this week. But in it was trying to say, how can we start bringing people from different disciplines to start thinking about this? What would a research roadmap look like? And from that, we built a Google Doc, of course, with over 200 research questions. And they emerged from the workshops, and we collapsed that list into a focus group of 46 questions. So how can we take that and build that into a convening like this? How do we ensure that we're not starting from scratch every time we do this? There was another meeting in January at USC Annenberg, funded by Hewlett and Ford, Digital Disinformation, Political Polarization. Again, similar people got together, had another great conference, more great ideas, more Google Docs. Now we're having another one here, and this is great, but I really don't want to be standing on stage next year being like, we all went to 67 conferences. Like, this is the time where we've really got to start thinking about how we do this. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is I put this, another Google Doc together a couple of weeks ago. I didn't organize this with I did a bit.ly link, so it's bit.ly/disinfo reporting. Because recently when I gave evidence at one of these inquiries, I said, you know what, if it wasn't for the likes of Julia Angwin or Jonathan Albright or Craig Silverman, there's a bunch of this stuff we wouldn't actually know about. And one of the main drivers of any reactions from the platforms has been journalists writing about this. Journalists using data from Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, reporting on it, and the platforms going, oh shit, we didn't realize that that's what happened when you looked at our data in these ways, which is kind of astonishing for all of us not to understand why this isn't coming from the platforms themselves. But how do we connect with the great research that's happening within the journalism community, support them, peer review that work, make sure that it's disseminated in the right places? So I'm just going to talk about a few challenges and then a few things that I would love to see us start grappling with. So the first one is we haven't agreed on scope, definitions, and boundaries. I just went to Google Scholar yesterday when I put these slides together, put in the term that I will not say. Surprise, surprise, academics aren't stupid. Academics know where the money is. We are still using this term in a way because it's a shorthand, in a way that I think you all know why I don't like it. It's unhelpful, it doesn't actually explain the ecosystem. But secondly, it's been weaponized, not just by Donald Trump, but by politicians around the world to describe anything they don't like. We can't keep moving in this direction using a phrase which is incredibly unhelpful. And as academics who take definitions seriously, how do we stop using this phrase? And how do we agree on scope, definitions, and boundaries? What are we studying, what we're not studying? What's in this, what's not in this? How do we actually map this visually? Because we're very good at doing data visualizations when we have access to the Twitter fire hose. How can we build something just as beautiful to map out all the different elements of this ecosystem and the research that already exists? And who's doing this best? So let's also be honest, so we can stop pointing with pointy elbows, pushing each other out the way because we can see funding dollars. Just have that conversation for a second, shall we? This is the sexiest topic that many of us in this space have seen for a long time. We're actually duplicating each other's work as opposed to pointing out who's doing what piece of this really, really well and allowing that person to do it and saying, you do this over there. How do we make sure that we cover all of this ground effectively? Because it's huge, this space. Or do we all say, no, this is a sliver, and we're just going to focus here? We're not having those conversations at all by the way that we name our conferences, who we invite, how we talk about it. Secondly, we have no benchmarks in terms of the scale of the problem. So money is being thrown at initiatives to try and solve this problem. We shouldn't even use the term solve. These are small interventions that together we might get out of this hellhole in 25 years. We're not going to solve it overnight. Talking to the platforms when I say, can I see your benchmarks there? I mean, even I talk to the platforms, they don't have these benchmarks internally. Well, if they don't have benchmarks internally, how the hell are they going to know if they're adding the fact check tag or the third-party fact-checking initiative, whether it's making any difference? So we need to, as a community, ensure that we have benchmarks. And part of that is because we have struggled to get access to the data from the platforms. But the scale of the problem is a huge challenge. And even in these debates in Europe, regulators were like, well, how bad is the problem? Actually, what is the problem? Oh, but we've got 4 weeks to write a report that we have to push out by the EU Commission. I mean, this is not going to stop, so we have to make sure we're in there helping. We have very little understanding of the impact of different types of information disorder, particularly as it crosses platforms and moves offline. It's been great this morning to hear discussions about television and talk radio, which often doesn't get included in these conversations. How do we capture dinner party conversations? How do we understand that a lot of the way that people thought about Hillary Clinton was because somebody came downstairs for dinner and was like, you're not going to believe this. She's part of a paedophile ring. And this is the challenge of just doing communication research. Offline measurement is incredibly difficult. Are we back in 1944 Lazarsfeld's two-step flow? This is actually about influencers. It's actually we need to really spend more time understanding how families communicate and who's more influential in those families and networks, particularly in an age of WhatsApp, as Ethan said. We're going to do a project in Brazil this year. The WhatsApp election is going to be all about WhatsApp. And that's before we start talking about India in 2019. The challenge of monitoring closed messaging apps and understanding persuasion and influence in those spaces is going to be very, very difficult. Almost all of the research we have was undertaken in the US, most of it from political communication or psychology. Great, there's a wonderful field with great research. How can we include more ethnography? How can we include more qualitative methods, which is why Data and Society's work is so wonderful. But how can we do more inter-border work? How can we do cross-cultural work? The regulatory framework that's being discussed in the UK and Europe is based entirely on US data. We have almost no data from Europe. And in fact, Rasmus Klein Nielsen at Oxford from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, did a very quick study about France versus Italy, so we would have just something. And it was like he actually found different patterns within France and Italy. We have to start doing this cross-border analysis as soon as possible. And finally, policymakers, practitioners, and educators are struggling to find research they can use. So in that, in the piece that we're putting out later this week from the Annenberg conference in December, these are from a couple of quotes from platform people. They're talking about research that we do. That work is actually 95% useless to the industry because we know that it's hard, we know that it's complicated, we know that it's ambiguous, but we've got to do something. So reading an analysis of why it's hard doesn't move us forward. So when our conclusion is it's complicated, what we need is more research, we love that. The industry, not so much. Another one, As such, platform representative, this is from Nick's write-up, so Nick Diaz, one of my colleagues, wrote this. As such, platform representative said brevity in research write-ups is greatly appreciated. One researcher also suggested that more papers reconciling and translating the immense volume of, at times, contradictory research would be beneficial. These papers could even be aggregated in a cross-disciplinary journal of disinformation, which, Yokai, you brought this up at the conference last February. And of course, within the academic field, we're like, well, who's going to publish in that journal? Because if somebody wants tenure, they've got to publish in the journal of their particular discipline. Sod that. Sod that. Like, we have to build a journal that creates a new field. And we have to say to people who are giving tenure, this stuff matters. Because whenever we talked to practitioners, this was something they just kept saying. And this is lovely Amy Sippett, who works at Full Fact in the UK. And the title of her chapter was, Why We Feel Woefully Underinformed About How We Can Do Our Jobs Better. And she came to the conference, she just said, you all know what we should be doing as fact checkers better, but I don't have any conversations with you. I don't know how you can help me do my job better. So we need to create, a multidisciplinary journal that publishes peer-reviewed, accessible research. Does not have to be 8,000 words. A rapid response group of multidisciplinary scholars to peer review self-published research and journalism. It is great that we're seeing more researchers publish on Medium, but we cannot afford to allow that to be taken down by people who say it's not peer reviewed. We shouldn't also have to wait 2 years to get our work published. There are smart people around this room who could create that group tomorrow, and we could start pushing it out to one another when we actually publish this stuff. For me, it's just non-negotiable, and we have to move. We've been talking about it for a year. We have to start doing it. A standardized set of methodologies that can be used at regular intervals across borders. If we build frameworks, there are researchers across the world who will say, I just want to do something which means that we can compare apples with apples. At the moment, if I use a different methodology, I can't compare it to somebody who's doing research in another country. This isn't to say that other people can't do other research, but how do we create that framework so we can have a body of work that we can start comparing and looking at patterns cross-border? And how can we do this in a way that allows us to have time series data? A set of ethics guidelines for doing research on this topic. If we're accessing data, what do we mean when we talk about anonymity? What does it mean about what kind of data sets we can access? What does it mean if we're actually doing research in closed networks that we've got access to and we've been monitoring for 3 years? Like, what are those kind of questions? How can those of us who are doing this research lead that conversation about what a set of ethics guidelines looks like for doing this research? And frameworks for civil society organizations to evaluate initiatives and projects in the field. It is wonderful that there is more money in this field than ever before, but just because we have access to money and we feel good if we've run an event or we've started a new media literacy project doesn't mean that we're actually not doing more harm than good. You know, when we did our research for cross-check in France, we did research because we maybe just did 10 weeks of really bad stuff in France. Maybe we should never replicate this again. We have to link civil society with researchers who can do rigorous, effective research that can be peer-reviewed, turned around, and written in an accessible way, beautifully designed by Data and Society's designer. That's what we should really be doing. So I'm just up here saying that. Oh, the last one, sorry. Mechanisms for ongoing conversations and collaborations between different communities. How can we ensure there are spaces, we don't need another flipping Slack channel, but how on earth can we all connect in a way? These conversations are happening on many. I even saw over the weekend somebody tweeted out, we've got a new fake news listserv. Join up here for daily emails. And I was like, we can't have another listserv, we can't have another Slack channel, but there are lots of people who really care about this, have a lot of knowledge and experience, and we just don't have the mechanisms to know how to do this well. And if this wasn't, as I would think, an emergency, I'm all right with that. But I actually think we're at a critical moment where this regulatory threat is real. And I just worry that we're just having lovely conferences and having lovely chats. And actually, we could be in a situation in 3 years' time when we're like, those chats were great, but we didn't see that happening in Singapore and Brazil or even Germany. You know, the Germans were doing it in very good faith. It's caused a huge chilling effect because of the regulation in Germany. The platforms will get fined. It's basically around hate speech. But they're so terrified they're taking down so much stuff and they don't have the mechanism to review that. You know, this is real. I know I'm standing on a stage in a country where regulation is often seen as a swear word. It's not a swear word in our continent, and it's coming down the tracks. How can we help regulators actually do pass responsible legislation, which I think many of us in this room would say it's time when we did start holding some of these platforms to account. So, thank you. And sorry if I was ranty lady, but any questions?
Oh, thank you. And Claire, I'm heartbroken that you're not here tomorrow, because a lot of the suggestions that you made up are actually exactly part of what we're trying to figure out here. I tried in my opening remarks to sort of make it clear that I'm not quite as popular as you, but I've been to my 12 conferences this last year. I'm pretty frickin' sick of it as well.
Yeah.
If we could get to the point where we have something like a shared research agenda on this and can sort of say, how do we learn from each other, would be one of the big things that could come out of this. Let's just take a moment or two. If we have questions for Claire, let me know, and I will try to take my blinders off and go find you. Please, we've got to have one or two. We endorse the entire research agenda. We're going to go with it for moment one. Where am I going? Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Stepping up, Anya.
Thank you. Claire, as you know, I'm writing this Oxford Research Encyclopedia entry on media credibility. So I was saying before, I have like 200 papers on the floor of my study, and yours is actually one of the best. And I agree with every single thing you're saying about the fact that the literature is totally inconsistent and that it's not reaching. I did a study this summer where we interviewed people around the world that are trying to fight lack of trust in media, and all the things they're doing. There's like absolute like newsroom visits and reaching out to citizens. There's no evidence that any of it will actually work. So I completely agree with you, and I think that it would be really helpful. I think part of what is so constructive about your work is the suggestions that you're making, and I think that right now probably the regulation thing is the most urgent. And I'm also wondering to what extent your work is going to be able to help the foundations that are funding all of these efforts as well. Because I do worry, as you do, about a lot of money that's going places where it's really maybe not going to make any difference at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. So actually in December when we had that Annenberg conference, we invited 10 of the funders, and many of the funders will say, this is really useful because we want to know what we should emphasize. So I do think that's part and parcel of this, is that, but I'm going to say this, which might be unpopular. I actually think we need better peer review systems for how we give out money. I'm just going to say this because I've sometimes benefited from this. Going to the right conferences. We go to conferences because we know we might bump into a funder and have a gin and tonic at 9 o'clock at night that might lead to some money. That's not how we should be getting and giving away money. That's not me and Jennifer. I just love Jennifer and love gins. We drink tea. But, compared to, but at the other end of the scale, we don't need Horizon 2020 from the EU where it's a 70-page PDF. There has to be a middle ground where we have better mechanisms for the money that we're giving out. And sometimes we have to give out more money. There's a lot of money going out, but it's going out in small amounts to lots of different disconnected initiatives.
Claire, you mentioned the rather wonderfully high commission to discuss the future of fake news at the EU.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe maybe you can't talk about it at all, but can you give us some general indication of how the discourse is developing in Brussels and how you see it heading and how they're thinking about it?
Yeah, I can't say anything really, but I think you can probably guess that the list is probably, there's 39 members on that group. There are many people from different, I'd say, stakeholder groups. So if you get a bunch of journalists in a room with people from platforms and civil society, you can imagine what those conversations sound like. But the thing that's been most striking is we keep saying this report needs to be evidence-based. And when we look around at evidence, there's actually not very much evidence that we can pull on to say this is enough in order to say we should do this. But the definitions thing is the hardest to do because everybody keeps looking at these code of conducts because they've had one for hate speech. But the difficulty of this space that is legal, and what do we mean? Even if we just say disinformation, which is false information that is shared deliberately to create harm, what does harm mean? We just haven't struggled with these. And so it seems fine at an academic conference if you're having it with regulators. I do think the EU, in the same way as the data protection law that's coming in the 1st of May, GDPR, I think that is showing what the EU can do, because Facebook has said, we will have that same standard globally, even though it's just for the EU. So I think the EU recognizes that they're in a very strong position. I think what will happen is, what will come out this year will be around self-regulation. If self-regulation doesn't get anywhere, we're going to see quite a big stick.
Claire,
do not quote me on that, please.
Can you talk just a little bit about, you talked about the fact that in many cases it's very difficult to measure impact, and we end up with this contagion model of, oh no, you've seen Russian disinformation, therefore you no longer believe in democracy. It seems like one of the recommendations has to be about how these organizations that we're working with share data. Do you have recommendations in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think partly in the last 18 months, because most of the work in this space has been done by journalists and people like Jonathan, it has set up this, which is absolutely right to do. They are terrified now that there's going to be this moment of like gotcha journalism if they allow this data out. And it allows them to say, yes, but the bad actors. I think what we need to do is come up with a framework that says the benefits of us having this data are so great, we need to solve for the bad actors bit, which might mean, as awful as it sounds, we have to have a kind of a safe, trusted space for a year to demonstrate that we're just trying to help. But I think the problem at the moment is the relationship that we have, which is journalists on one side, the platforms on the other, throwing grenades at each other's trenches saying, you're a publisher, no you're not, yes you are, no you're not. We haven't got anywhere. So there isn't, I don't think there's a trust yet to get that data, but we need it.
Hi, you've got 30 seconds, unfortunately.
Just specifically on this point, I think we may need, I mean, when you think of public health data, it's not available to journalists. It's available to vetted classes of academics within academic institutions that can impose disciplinary measures on abuses. And I suspect that's going to be the model, much to the chagrin of journalists, if we're going to do it. But then we need to agree that that's the direction we're going in.
Yeah, and just the last thing I'll say very quickly is anybody who has data has to work collectively to ensure, because we've also seen this as academics, oh, I've got access to secret Facebook data, this is going to be great for my career. Like we have to say, this is about public health of democracy. And so I have a fear that we have to work as a coalition. I don't know who's going to get the data, but I think that data will come out. I think we have to push back very strongly if it's only to a certain group, is how does everybody trust that group?
Big thanks to Claire. Thank you so much.